Non si ferma, è incredibile.
And also the language issue, because, having to speak English and having so many different ways to speak English. And hello and good afternoon. My name is Christine Ockrent, and it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here in Brussels for this event to mark the 10th anniversary of the European External Action Service. And indeed, to do so, we have an extraordinary panel today as we welcome you, Josep Borrell. You are the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security and Vice President of the European Commission. We have with us Federica Mogherini. You are now the Rector of the Collège d'Europe in Bruges, and you were in charge in the same job between 2014 and 2019. And it is indeed a great pleasure to welcome Javier Solana. Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Solana. You are in Madrid.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being with us. You are now the president of the Center for Global Economy and Geopolitics in Madrid, and you have been in that job for 10 years, from 1999 to 2009, when the Lisbon Treaty decided to merge the external relations with the foreign policy, common foreign policy service. Of course, we would have loved to have Catherine Ashton, Lady Ashton, with us as well, but with the COVID situation currently in the UK, it was not possible. Now, 10 years, a long time, and indeed a tumultuous time to freshen up common memories. Let's have a look at a few extraordinary moments. Javier Solana, let me turn to you first. What of a quick reaction? What is the most memorable moment for you among all of those that we've just seen?
Well, to choose the most memorable moment is difficult. I think that the most important part of our mandate, our time, was to put in place the first capabilities for the European Union to act internationally, collectively, and also outside the European Union for peacekeeping operations. It was the first time that the European Union was outside their borders and peacekeeping operations, and I think that was fundamental. We did about 30 operations in Africa, in the Middle East, everywhere in the world, even in the countries of the Pacific, and that was a really presence of the European Union as an actor. And I think that for me, if I have to resume, the most important part is to put Europe not only as an actor internally, but as an actor externally in a very complicated moments. Remember that we had, at the beginning of my mandate, we have two very important events. One was September 11, that changed the situation in the world. And the second, 2 months later, was the entrance of China in the WTO, that changed also the relationship between the world and China.
Mr. Solana, we'll have time to, of course, deal in more detail with those very important moments. But let me turn to you, Mrs. Mogherini. Again, the most moving moment for you. The most emotional
I would
one.
say two, if you allow me. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for doing this. I think it's great. Well, one is the obvious one when we reached the agreement on the Iran nuclear deal. 14th of July, a special day for the French friends, 2015. That night when we achieved, after many years of negotiations that actually Javier started, when we achieved the nuclear deal with Iran, that was a very emotional and important moment. But equally emotional and important for me was when we managed to approve the PESCO decision, the Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defence, with the foreign and defence ministers of the European Union countries. That was also, for me, a very special moment, because everybody was saying that it would have been impossible, and we achieved it. And it was, for me, a special moment, following and building on the work that Javier had started back then.
Mr. Borrell, it's exactly 1 year that you're in office. We all know you're an avid, very energetic blogger. In that 1 year, you've commented a lot about what you've done. But again, the most memorable moment so far, just one.
Maybe the first day, when I went to the La Cour des Invalides for the mourning of the French soldiers who were killed in Mali, just the same day that they took in office. It was a good example of how Europeans are engaged to keep peace and to fight against terrorism. And it was moving, certainly.
We now have about an hour or so to discuss what has been achieved by the External Service during these past 10 years, the successes, but also the obstacles, the difficulties, the lessons learned, so to speak. But I think it's also very important, of course, to look to the future, and indeed to the present, to this ever-changing geopolitical scene where we see so many different actors, so many different threats. And so it will be, I think, very interesting to ask our three distinguished guests their views about how the European Union can best protect and promote its own interests and its sovereignty. But before that, we need you viewers from all over the world to share your views and to take part in this discussion. Christophe, Robert, let me turn to you.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome to the newsroom of the European Council. Indeed, we want the viewers to be part of the story. We want the viewers to be part of this discussion. There are many ways for you to get in touch with us and share your thoughts on the European External Action Service and EU foreign policy. First, you can ask your questions directly to the High Representatives by leaving a message on the EAS social media platforms. That's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Remember to use our hashtag EEAS10 as 10th anniversary. Meanwhile, we're also conducting a poll on Slido. If you don't know Slido, it's very easy. All you need to do is type Slido in your browser. You'll need to enter an event code, which happens to be our hashtag. I'm sure you've remembered it by now. It's hashtag EEAS10, and you can answer about 4 questions on EU foreign policy. We'll be happy to share the results as well as your questions in the Q&A session at the end of the show. So we count on you. We count on you to be part of this event. And meanwhile, we've asked a number of key diplomatic actors to share their memories. Let's have a look at our first testimonials. I'm sure you'll recognize familiar faces.
European unity has brought peace, prosperity and a better tomorrow for millions of people across several generations. Today, people in Europe and around the world are once again looking to a strong and committed European Union to work with partners in saving lives and leading the global recovery. You are an inspiration for what is possible when nations come together with unity of purpose. I would like to thank you for the exemplary partnership that exists between the United Nations and the European Union. I know that we can count on you to continue to uphold the universal values of peace and human rights, address climate change robustly, and work towards a more inclusive and sustainable world for all. Thank you.
I believe the entire world benefits when Europe is strong, unified, and more active on the global stage. For this reason, I have both welcomed and applauded the work of the European External Action Service for the past 10 years. The External Action Service has helped Europe develop the stronger voice it has always needed, while giving Europe, friends and allies, what they have always wanted, a number to call and a friend on whom they can always count. And for the last 4 years, the Trump administration mistakenly treated the European Union as a rival. Joe Biden understands the critical role that the European Union must play for shaping a better future for us all, and his administration will be counting on the EU as a trusted friend and partner, because there is nothing we cannot do together and very little we can accomplish apart. So thank you very much for asking me to share my views, and congratulations to the EAS on 10 outstanding years.
Thank you, Madeleine Albright, and I can think of no better introduction to get into the first chapter of this discussion, partnership. Together when possible, alone when needed. Jean Monnet, whose memoirs are on this very table, which is only proper, Jean Monnet famously said, "Europe will be built through crises and will be the addition of the solutions to these crises." Well, indeed, the pandemic has struck our continent in a very harsh and cruel fashion. Of course, the situation is different from one country to the other, but it has certainly shown that health is a security issue, a sovereignty issue, and therefore a European Union issue which cannot be tackled properly at the national level. Mr. Borrell, you have insisted on the necessity for Europeans to build a common narrative, and indeed the pandemic has compelled such a narrative to be built. We know that health is not part of common policies, but it has become one.
Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was a battle of narrative, because everybody was trying to present themselves as the best one. the ones who were able to solve the problem at home and to help others around the world. And it's very important to have a narrative, a story to tell, a vision, to present yourself to the rest of the world and to have an idea to transmit. And we Europeans, we have to work more on that because we have a project, but most of the time we don't sell it enough.
But there has been progress. I mean, the pandemic has compelled us, has compelled the Commission, has compelled you to come forward with the vaccine, I mean, to buy, to pre-buy, so to speak, to raise money, to buy vaccines, and indeed, as of late, last week or so, to put forward a proposal to create a new European health safety agency. So, again, that narrative is being built.
Because the crisis has shown our vulnerabilities. Suddenly, a mask, a very humble thing, easy to produce, became a strategic object. We were vulnerable because we were not producing paracetamol. We were on the hands of the producers very far away. We thought that the market was going to solve and every demand was going to be matched by an offer. But when the crisis came, it was clear that this was not the case. So we have to gain autonomy. We have to regain capacity to face the problems by ourselves. And this is one of the biggest lessons of this crisis.
Javier Solana, when you took office, there were many crises of a different kind, and especially in the Balkans. You were formerly the NATO Secretary General. You jumped into onto the European scene, and you succeeded, and I think it was the first success to credit the external action with. You succeeded in preventing a war in Macedonia. So, again, what is the lesson learned when there is such pressure, the pressure of events?
Well, I will to make two comments. The first comment is that it is true that when the situation like the one we're living today with the pandemic, etc., what should be the reaction of the European Union? For me, the pandemic has had a very important reaction from the European Union, which made the reaction to this crisis of the European Union very different from the reaction that we had at the 2008, at the moment of the big economic crisis. So the change of the reaction during that crisis 2008 and the reaction in this crisis of 2011 is very different, 2020 is very different, and that is because we have learned a lot from the past. The second thing I would like to say is that as far as peacekeeping operations or peacemaking operations, really we have started with much less infrastructure than the one that Federica had or Borrell has today. I think we had less power in a sense, but we had more influence. Probably the High Representative of today has more power, more people at their disposal, etc. But in my time, we had less power, but I dare to say that we had more influence.
Federica Mogherini, would you subscribe to that? More influence then, more power today?
Well, I think the world today is probably a little bit more complex. It was difficult. It's equally difficult, probably, but I think that in those years we were still quite recently out of the Cold War. The dynamics in the world were a little bit clearer than today. I think today what the High Representative today has to handle is an unprecedented complexity. You have different world players, each of them playing a different game in a different setup, building I would say, variable geometries partnerships, depending on the field. You can be a partner with someone on trade, and you can be on a different page on human rights.
That's politely said.
Very much so. I am keeping a little bit of diplomatic attitude, but very little. Let's say that the complexity in the relations, in the external relations, in the global politics, I think is growing. And I think it's true, the power has increased, the influence is more challenged. But I think what makes really the difference today is the economy of scale. The pandemic has shown that Europeans are safer, are better protected, even in their health, if they are together as Europeans, because no country alone is big enough to handle any of the challenges that are out there, including a pandemic. I think of the repatriation of Europeans at the beginning of the crisis. Mm-hmm. The European Union doesn't have consular competences, and yet it was the External Action Service helping member states to bring back home Europeans that were spread in the world in very difficult circumstances. So I think that this jump between the power and the influence can be bridged with the narrative that is being built.
And Josep Borrell, also the pace has fastened. The electronic pace has really taken hold of each and every one of us. So there's more impatience also from public opinion. And also, and that's an improvement, it seems to me, Europe as such is seen by public opinion throughout the continent as more useful than before.
The crisis has shown that the Union makes us stronger and gives us more capabilities. The crisis has bring this value added to the Union, and people understand that together we are able to react better. The bringing back 600,000 stranded Europeans around the world is done much better if we gather the forces and the capability of the 27 member states, that if everyone tries to save their own nationals. You know, for one moment, here, the External Action Service, we became a gigantic travel office, trying to match the planes that were going all around the world with the European flag, trying to put all the Europeans alone together in planes of different nationalities. And this was a fantastic exercise of coordination, cooperation, and solidarity. And the crisis also has helped us to a breakthrough on the European integration. Who could imagine without the virus, we wouldn't have the next generation EU. Without the virus, we wouldn't be asking 700,000 million euros to the financial markets. Without the virus, we would not be going from loans to grants, transfers. We have been stepping the integration of the European Union and also its external dimension, because today we have to show to our partners, especially in Africa, that we are able to help, that we have the will and the capabilities. And this will increase our influence. This will make us perceive as someone that counts, that helps, that deserves, not only the Europeans, but for the rest of mankind.
Javier Solana, during your 10 years of office, the influence you were telling us about took place in a multilateral system, which was in many ways in a better shape than it is today. What, in your view, should be done in order to restore multilateralism, which is very much a pillar of the European external action?
Well, I think in my times, the structure of the multilateral.
We have a short technical.
Started to work, and it's okay.
Yes, it's fine.
The WTO was a fundamental institution. We had, during my time, the G20 started. but still we're an organization that we're at the beginning. Now, today the organizations are more stable, but the will of the countries to use those multilateral institutions is less. Now, it's not a question of lack of institution, it's lack of political will to use them. When you have the United States saying American first, imagine if everybody will say, I want to be first. It's the end of the game of multilateralism. Therefore, in my times, that didn't happen. Let me give you an example. You remember that in the middle of the Olympic Games in Beijing, at the same time was a big conflict between Russia and Georgia. It was a big conflict, you remember, and I tell you how that was resolved. It's resolved in a trip that I did to Moscow. And I met with, at the time, President of the Russian Federation, which was Medvedev. At that time, Putin was the Prime Minister. And we signed a document whereby in 15 days, the European Union will deploy sufficient police forces to control the borders, and then the Russian forces will withdraw. Well, that was done. It was signed in lunch, and it was done, and in 15 days the Russians left and the European Union took over the borders. So this is the type of thing that I say, that without having a lot of power, we had the feasibility, the influence to really use the mechanism of personal relations, etc., to really obtain what it was important to obtain, that the Russians withdrew from the borders of Georgia. So this is the type of thing that I like to underline, because sometimes the amount of power quotation marks, people in our service, etc., makes more difficult the personal relations that at a given moment are so crucial to resolve a problem.
Josep Borrell, there will be a council of the heads of state and government next week, a virtual one, of course. And there's a document floating around in the media stressing the need for a new global alliance with the forthcoming Biden administration in the US. An alliance, a partnership that needs maintenance and renewal, says that document. It also underlines a concept that you have been promoting as of late, which is the European strategic autonomy. So partnership and autonomy. Explain.
I can explain, because I've been spending quite a big number of hours during this weekend to finalize this text together with my team and the Commission colleagues that is floating, as you say, in the media. And it's just a call, if I can say, to make multilateralism great again.
That's a nice quote.
Yes, it's a mix of a previous quote and looking to the future. We have to go back to a world where might doesn't make right, because that's multilateralism, the agreement among people who share responsibilities and capabilities to face common challenges. And I think Javier is very much right. Today there is a lack of a political will to look for agreements. Look what's happening at the United Nations. Every time there is less agreements or more vetoes. And we have to go back to the negotiation table in order to act together. And there, we, Europeans, which are multilateral by essence, can bring a strong push to this new world. And as you said at the beginning, alone when necessary.
Alone as Europeans.
Together when possible. And this is autonomy, because, you know, which is the contrary of autonomy? Dependency. Do we want to be dependent? No, we don't. Nobody wants to be dependent. So we have to be autonomous in order to act by our own means, facing the problems we have that nobody else will solve. This is not the denial of NATO or the transatlantic relations. Transatlantic relations and European autonomy, strategic autonomy, go together. The more we will be able to participate on these relations, the better. And for that, we have to be able. Autonomous means able to act.
Able to act, Federica Mogherini, in many fields, not only conflicts in a sort of traditional acceptance of that notion, but we see today that in trade, but also when it comes to data, when it comes to technological dependency, these are areas where indeed the external service has to promote European interests, which can be quite different from those of partners, traditional partners.
For sure, I think this concept of, I would say, getting the chance of revitalizing multilateralism with the incoming US administration, and at the same time not losing all the work that has been done to build up the European strategic autonomy, is the challenge of this year that is going to celebrate the 10 years of the External Action Service. Investing in multilateralism with partners and keeping the awareness, I would say, that if needed, Europeans can stand on their own feet. That is, I think, the key points to be preserved. And this is true in diplomatic action, but I think it's even more true, probably, in other fields you mentioned. You know, the European Union has a lot of influence when it comes to some issues. The normative power. I don't think that anybody else in the world has the same normative capacity than the European Union, for good and for bad, but mainly for good. The economic power. And also, if you allow me to introduce an element that is more linked to principles than to interest, to me the two things go together, the rights, the human rights, the rights of the people. And I think that if you put these elements together, including the digital investments that the European Union needs to do, I think this is probably a field where Europeans need to run a bit to catch up the gap that is there with other world powers. I think that makes of the European Union a world power indeed. Yeah, I think this mix of being more aware of our own capacity to act, and together reinvesting in partnerships with it, which is our DNA, is going to increase our capacity to act in the world.
Javier Solana, you want to comment?
Oh yeah, I would like to say very clear and loudly that I agree completely with what Borrell has said about strategic autonomy. I think the strategic autonomy of the European Union is a fundamental concept. In our first security strategy, which I chaired, still we were not ready to say that as clearly as I am saying it today. But the philosophy was there. Now, the most important moment of breaking of this concept of strategic autonomy was during the Iraq crisis. The Iraq war was a catastrophe. The European Union broke. The United Nations broke. Everybody broke. And because in the case of the European Union, because we couldn't have an autonomous reaction to that. And the European Union was broken, and half of the European Union went to Iraq, another half didn't want to go to Iraq. And that was a very important crisis. That crisis has not to be repeated. The European Union cannot break on these decisions, and because our autonomy, our strategic autonomy, should allow us to resolve these problems in a better manner than by breaking the European Union.
Let us now, there would be so much more to say, but we have to turn to the second chapter of this discussion, and it has to do with the role of the European Union as a security provider. A few pictures. today we see indeed that there are so many conflicts in the world, and conflicts of different kinds, not only traditional armed conflicts, but also an increased competition again in the narratives, Mr. Borrell. Currently, I believe there are 17 operations that the External Service is conducting, 6 which are military operations and 11 civilian ones. And since you took office, you added one which has to do with Libya, to try and control arms trafficking with Libya, with a lovely Greek name, Irene, which means peace. Tell us about those operations. What have the priorities changed in your view?
It's a way of putting in practice the idea of pooling capacities at the service of a common security and defense policy. You know, the Europeans have to understand that our security starts very far away from our borders. What's happening in Sahel, what's happening in Somalia affects directly our security. So if we want to be part of the global efforts to make a more secure world, we have to engage. We have 5,000 men and women all around the world, 5,000 on this mission, bringing help to train armed forces, to be present in the ground, sometimes facing their lives, in order to protect their citizens and to build an order. Because, you know, we Europeans, we don't know how happy we are of being Europeans. The big privilege of being Europeans and enjoying peace, security, rule of law, order at home. This is exceptional. The biggest part of the world doesn't enjoy the same situation. And I think that we have a moral responsibility and also in our own interest to try to help the rest of the world to build something like we have. And it's in our own interest because, as I said, the soldiers and the civil servants who are in Mali, who are in Somalia, or who are in Bosnia-Herzegovina, or who are in Kosovo, they are working for our security. And this is step by step the way of building a common defense capability. Not yet an European army, but part of the Europeans, in plural, armies working together.
Federica Mogherini, the European defense, that's a very difficult, dicey process. It's been going on for some time with new tools under your leadership with PESCO. So let me translate because you're all used to this résumé, as we say in French, permanent structured cooperation on security and defense. Also a European Defence Fund, which of course is quite underfunded to be clear. European Peace Facility. What are these new tools able to do in order to indeed convince European member states that we should all engage into a more common approach to defense issues?
You know, Javier mentioned the security strategy he was drafting and then publishing during his mandate. I think one of the key elements of the external action during my mandate was actually under his advice also, that of working on a global strategy for the European Union. Then that came right after the British referendum and right before the Trump administration came in office, so it was a turbulent moment. But that contained not only the key concept of strategic autonomy for the European Union, but contains the proposal to the member states to advance finally, after so many decades, on a common European Union defense action. And that part was, I would say, really implemented. To my own surprise, I perfectly remember, if I can share an anecdote, and someone in the room might remember this, many were saying, this is very dangerous because member states will react very negatively to that. You should probably not invest so much political capital in something that is, controversial. And yet, I think we managed to build this new instruments you mentioned, the permanent structured cooperation, which basically means that member states put together resources to run common projects to build capabilities on the defense sector together, economy of scale. So it's not only useful for defense, it's also good for the economy, let me say so, which is in these times not irrelevant. Doing more operations together, coordinating the budgets on investments on defense. So somehow working on a common defense at the European level, not a European army, but putting things together on an economy of scale. This was possible, I think, because Europeans understood that, what Josep was saying, security inside Europe can only be built if we invest in security outside of the European Union. The refugee crisis, Syria, reminded Europeans of that. The terrorist attacks on European soil reminded us that if we do not face security challenges in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, everywhere in the world, we are less secure at home. And so for once, European citizens and public opinions were demanding more European action on something which was at that moment defense. And we managed to build consensus and turn plans into action. If you ask me what was probably the thing I was most proud of in my 5 years, probably it was just that one.
Let me turn with you, Javier Solana, to the issue of NATO. We know that within the European Union, all member states do not have quite the same views of how integrated Europe should remain within the military alliance. 21 member states are NATO allies. And you were, of course, we all remember, you were Secretary General of NATO before becoming High Representative. How do you see today the way, the interaction between NATO as a military alliance and indeed the need to increase and build up common European defense capabilities?
Well, let me be very clear on this topic. I think that the European Union capabilities on military matters is fundamental. It's fundamental for us. It is much better for the rest of the world, because the world will have also a capability for the European Union without having to be a capability through NATO. And that it may not happen frequently, but it has to be considered a possibility of that happening. And I think for that, we have to continue working on what Federica has said, which I support completely. Now, on the second thing I would like to say is that capabilities, on that sense, it helps also our technology, our technological independence. And that is another fundamental issue for the European Union. We cannot be dependent technologically from the United States or from any other country. We have to be able to be technologically more sophisticated ourselves. And that is part also of the elements of our security, the technological security. And without having that decision that was taken under Federica, it would be very difficult that we will have the technological capabilities that are needed. So let's not fight about this. To have capabilities in the European Union is better for us, it's better for the Americans, and it's better for NATO. And therefore, let's do it.
Josep Borrell, you have insisted many times already on the need to improve a common strategic culture, which indeed includes the partnership, the NATO issues, all the issues that Mrs. Mogherini talked about. How can we concretely improve such cohesion when it comes to dealing with China? We haven't really talked about that yet, but a lot of these issues have to do with China. Trade, human rights, values, of course, and the fact that we see, and it will be the same probably most certainly with the Biden administration, that the confrontation between Washington and Beijing will increase, if only on the technological front. So what should we as Europeans do?
You mentioned a strategic culture. I think it's very important. You know, foreign policy, it's a way of projecting your identity to the rest of the world. And today, the Europeans don't have the same understanding of the world. And it's quite natural because they don't share the same history, the same culture, even not the same geography, the same neighbors. So we don't understand the world in the same way. We don't have the same perception of the threats. We don't share the same understanding of what is a threat, what is threatening me. Because when you say defense, with respect what?
And against whom?
And how? But first, which is the threat? And from Cadiz to Helsinki, or from Stockholm to Athens, we don't share the same understanding of which are our threats. Some threats are much more perceived, you are close to them, no? For sure, the threats coming from the east are better perceived in the Baltics than in Andalusia. So we have to build a common understanding of the world, to have a common perception of the threats in order to be able to have a common answer to these threats.
And how do we do that?
We are working what we call the strategic compass, la boussole stratégique, which is a way of putting together all the intelligence services of all member states and the defense ministers and the foreign ministers in order to make a kind of inventario, a balance of what the world is about today. China is not the same thing today that 10 years ago, for sure not. Africa will not be the same thing 5 years from now than today. So let's try to make an exercise of forecast and understanding and sharing the understanding. And this will require hours of discussion, hours of meetings, disagreements.
Sleepless nights.
And let's try at the end, in a couple of years, because it takes time, to put in our table a common perception of the world, overcoming the difference of the history. Because our relation with the US and with NATO cannot be perceived equally if you are Polish or you are Spanish, by historical reasons. But looking at the future, to have to share what you call a strategic culture, and I think is the most important thing to have. Without having a common strategic culture, it's going to be very difficult to have a real common foreign and security policy.
Let's now turn to the third part of this discussion, which has to do with the European Union as a principled actor and respected mediator. And then, of course, I turn to Javier Solana, because indeed the most remarkable achievement that you have also been very much involved with, Federica Mogherini, and also Catherine Ashton, is Iran, the treaty with Iran. And you started the whole process, Javier Solana. How did you manage to build the architecture of negotiations and play it in such a way that the EU got into the leading seat, the conductor seat?
Okay, let me remind you that the first trip that I did to Tehran in order to open up a negotiation was 2003. So a long time ago. And it was its initiative of the Europeans. At that time, I was going alone with the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the European Union, but without the United States, without China, without Russia. As the things started moving, we called the Russians, the Americans, and the Chinese. The Russians and the Chinese wanted to join the group. The Americans joined the group, but didn't want to participate in any of the meetings. So we have a rather complicated situation that lasted all the period of President Ahmadinejad. It was when Mr. Rouhani won the elections that we could restart a different strategy, which Federica did very well. But in the middle was a moment in which President Obama was in office, I was High Representative, and Rouhani called me, and I visited him, and he told me he was not still president, but he thought he was going to be the president, that they will be ready to establish talking with the Americans. And I spent 3 days with Rouhani in Tehran, and I returned, I talked to my European friends and told them, I think the situation is mature, is ripe to start negotiating together with the Americans in Tehran. And that's what happened. President Obama told me yes, and they started firstly in a secret manner and then publicly. But let me tell you again, the president of the United States was Obama. And we had started this process way before, in 2003. So a strategic patience, a strategic tenacity of that negotiation was absolutely fundamental. And this is why I wouldn't cry, but I really, the day that President Trump decided to abandon the treaty, the agreement with Iran, for me, one of the most, the saddest news that I ever had. Because the effort that had been put over so many years to get something so important in matters pertaining to nuclear power, which it was really an irresponsibility of such a dimension to break that I hope very much that President Biden repairs that mistakes.
Mrs. Mogherini, you had to follow up and indeed to build up upon this original achievements that Mr. Solana is talking about. What has been the most difficult part? Has it been dealing with the Americans in those days, even the Obama administration, dealing with the UK, France and Germany, the 3 EU member states which have conducted their own bilateral relations? But you had to keep imposing the EU in the leading role.
There was no need to impose it, actually. The work that was started in 2003 by Javier, that was then recognized by the United Nations, because the format of the negotiations is present in a UN Security Council resolution that indicates the High Representative as the facilitator of the mediation. So there's a clear recognition of role for the European Union External Action Service. And then also the work that Catherine Ashton did in between made it natural for everybody, being it the United States, Iran, the Europeans, Russia and China, and our own public opinions, to recognize the role of the High Representative and of the European Union.
But still you had to synchronize all those.
Well, there's a lot of work. Somehow we tested some lockdown experiences during those negotiations. We spent weeks without getting out of our negotiating place for at least twice during the first months of my mandate. What is sometimes not very well known, and I would like to say it because here we're celebrating also the quality of the European diplomacy, is that the text of that very important and very sophisticated nuclear agreement is the result of the work of the technical teams of the External Action Service. That 100 and something pages, that is the JCPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, is the result of the work of the diplomats and the officials of the External Action Service that spends hours, nights and days defining the nuclear-related aspects, defining the sanctions-lifting-related aspects with all the different delegations. And it was always recognized that the European leadership was there because not only we started the process, but also because we had the competencies, and we were perceived as the honest broker and the mediator that everybody could trust. So that was not difficult. The difficult part came when Trump decided to leave the agreement.
Of course.
That was the moment of truth. And for me, that was the test of the European strategic autonomy. Are we able to keep unity on something that is a fundamental interest of the Europeans, keeping the agreement alive, waiting for a new administration then to rejoin it one day? Are we able to keep the agreement alive with the Iranians, with the others, with the United Nations, with the Russians, the Chinese, with whom in the meantime we have other problems? Are we able to keep that file alive? And we did. That for me was a fundamental test of the European capacity to be autonomous under a lot of pressure from Washington.
It's alive, but how could I put it?
It's not in a good shape,
Exactly.
but it's alive and can be revitalized at full. I know Josep is working to do it. And I think this is going to be the crucial moment to prepare and help the Iranians and the Americans going back to full compliance in the months to come. I leave it to him, but I think that this is a crucial moment, and I'm sure that as we manage to start the negotiations, to conclude the negotiations, and to keep the agreement somehow alive, I'm sure that the Europeans and the European Union and Josep will manage to hover somehow the full compliance to the agreement, and maybe even build on that in the future.
Well, precisely, Mr. Borrell. Under the sponsorship of the European Council on Foreign Relations, 5 former foreign ministers have published an open letter asking you, as the chair of the Joint Committee, to take the initiative and indeed ask the Biden administration, I guess in the afternoon of January 20th, not to waste any more time, to indeed revitalize, revamp, relaunch the JCPOA. How can you do that if on the Iranian side, given the assassination of one of the chief nuclear scientists not that many days ago, there will be a difficult domestic political situation in Iran?
Yes, you said rightly assassination. And I issued a statement saying that this was a criminal act, because you have to call a shah, a cat, a cat. Mm. And I'm sorry to say, but this is not the way of solving problems. We are not going to prevent Iran going nuclear by killing their experts on nuclear science. And there are people who doesn't want the JCPOA to revive. And we have been working during this year to keep this deal alive, in spite of the American withdrawal. And thanks God, the Europeans has remained united on keeping this deal alive as much as we have been able. It's still there, and I hope that we will be able to bring back both parts, the US and Iran. Iran is in the deal, but he has to go back to full compliance of their nuclear responsibilities if they have the reward that the deal was contending. Because the deal is a deal. A deal is not just a nuclear side, it's a nuclear and an economic side. And for us Europeans, it's very important for our security. And that's why we strive a lot to keep this deal alive. And we hope that we will be able to keep Iran of not being a nuclear power. Without the deal, Iran would already be a nuclear power.
Right.
And bringing stability and security to the whole region. And I appreciated a lot the letter of my colleagues and friends, starting by Javier, Carl Bildt and others. I can tell you that we already have a date for the meeting of the board of the JCPOA, which I am acting as coordinator before Christmas. And we will do whatever we can in order to make this deal be a security provider for the whole region.
Let's now turn to another part of the world, excuse me, where indeed the European Union has been a very efficient mediator. Let's turn to Latin America and to you, Christophe Hobbit, because I believe we have a testimony, a witness which wants to tell us all the good things he thinks about us.
Absolutely, Christina. We'll hear this very important witness in literally a couple of seconds. I also want to seize this opportunity to remind our viewers that they can put their questions directly to the High Representatives through Slido or by using our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You've been very, very active so far, so keep on sending your questions and please vote in our poll on Slido. But as you said, Christine, we're very happy to share another testimonial from former President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. Let's take a listen right now.
My experience and my relationship with the European Union goes way back. When I was chief negotiator of the International Coffee Agreement, when we created the World Trade Organization, but most recently and most important, the role that Europe played in the Colombian peace process. It was a very important role. The support it always gave me, the appointment of a special envoy, the advice I received, and all that Europe did for this process to be successful. I only have words of gratitude, and I hope that the European Union continues to play an important role in world affairs, in mediating between different interests that are in conflict, and in strengthening multilateralism, and in building back better after the pandemic.
Federica Mogherini, do you remember those days? We all remember that awful kind of civil war between the FARC and the central government in Bogota, and Mr. Santos, who got the Nobel Peace Prize for a result of his policies. But what do you remember most?
Well, the constant contact with him, for sure, with his team, with the foreign minister, but with him directly, constantly, sometimes even several times a week. Mainly on, not so much on advising, but on offering support. The European Union was not a formal mediator in the peace process, but was an accompanying power somehow, offering support on several issues on which we have European experience. Because the point is this, I think Europeans can be trusted mediators in conflict solutions because we have experienced conflicts on our own soil. Everywhere in Europe, from Spain to Italy, to Ireland, to any country of Europe has sad histories of recent conflicts, not to mention the Balkans. So we can share, we understand what it takes to heal the wounds. We understand the need to reconcile, to reintegrate the fighters, to offer incentives for peace, and also to invest in what comes after the treaty or the agreement is signed, which is the most difficult moment. So with President Santos, we were talking about this almost on a daily basis, fine-tuning the support that the European Union could give to accompany not only the agreement and the negotiations, but most importantly, the day after. And I can say that, I don't think it's too much to say that the European Union was one of the key reasons why the agreement was reached in the first place and then was started to be implemented. And here again, when there was a change in presidency and in administration in Colombia, we kept working with the current administration to keep implementing the parts of the agreement that they wanted to keep in place. I think this was an excellent example of how the European investments on a peace process far away, but again, that was touching also European citizens, very much so. We all have memories about that, was fundamental to solve a 50 years old conflict.
Right.
And the same role the European Union can play today, for instance, I think, in accompanying Afghanistan towards peace. I think the European Union has a very powerful impact on conflict resolution and especially reconciliation the day after an agreement is reached.
Mr. Borrell, Federica Mogherini mentioned the Balkans, but that indeed is not really over with. The conflict between Serbia and Kosovo, you mentioned earlier, there's still a military EUCOR, a military European mission there. And of course, the enlargement perspective was always a way to try and entice better relations and indeed negotiations. Well, enlargement is no longer such an easy perspective to suggest. So what can be done in that part of Europe where indeed the situation is still not very stable?
We are doing a lot. Allow me to say that I am very proud to have relaunched the negotiations between Kosovo and Serbia on the auspices of the European Union.
Because the Trump administration tried to do that and then didn't quite work out.
Yes, and we are very happy they want to help. There is a work for everybody, but who takes the lead, who is in charge, who is responsible, is the European Union, because only the European Union can make an offer such important for these people, which is the European perspective. It is on the European perspective that this problem has to be solved. The other day I went to Sarajevo. It was the 25th anniversary of the Dayton Agreement. 17,000 people were killed, civilians were killed in Sarajevo. And what was very sad is that it was impossible to hold a common celebration of the Dayton Agreements. It was impossible. That everybody was gathering together just to remember this tragedy and to try to overcome it in the future. The division still remains. The wounds of the history are very deep. The scars are on the skin, on the psychological skin of this part of the world. But we cannot deny the European perspective. We have to invest. We have just approved a big investment plan in order to accompany the development of their economies, in order to avoid these countries to be just emptied. You know, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, 6% of the population has migrated. Where? 6% of the population has left the country. Where? To the Central Europe. We cannot allow to have a ventre mou, a soft belly in the heart of Europe. And we have to invest, we have to engage, and we have to try to bring cooperation in one side, in every side, from judiciary to economic to diplomatic to, if you want, even a kind of understanding of what and how this happened, in order to try to avoid that this could happen again. And this is one of the most important responsibilities for the Europeans, is our immediate neighborhood. If we are not able to solve the problems in our immediate neighborhood, how can we pretend to be a geopolitical actor?
Indeed, and before we turn to the questions, which I'm sure Christophe has selected for the three of you, let me turn to you, Mr. Solana. If you were to prioritize today, which are the current conflicts, the current crises, and there are so many, which, in your view, would deserve an European action first? Again, you know, there are so many. Federica Mogherini mentioned Afghanistan, but of course there's Turkey, a NATO ally, threatening Greece and Cyprus. Which of the current crises, in your view, are indeed the priority?
Can I mention two? I will mention two which are very linked in a way. I think where Europe has disappeared is in Syria. I think to recover the presence on Syria in order to finalize a peace agreement, it will be very important for the European Union. We cannot abandon a country so important as Syria. And second, Lebanon. Lebanon and Syria are interrelated in a way. The Russians have entered, the Turks are playing, and the European Union is a little bit behind. I would like very much to see the European Union in these two conflicts, which are so close to us physically, and with consequences as far as migration, etc., very, very deep in our lives. So these two places, to me, is where we should recuperate presence.
Thank you. Christophe, let me turn to you. What are the questions, the most difficult questions, which our viewers want to ask to our three distinguished guests?
Well, Christine, we've received a lot of reactions from our viewers, and that's great news. Maybe before I turn to the questions, I'd like to reveal the preliminary results of our poll on Slido. Remember the first question we asked: has the European Union become a stronger actor in the world in the last decade? 84% of respondents believe it has, while 16% believe Europe hasn't become a stronger actor. Second question: what is the main global, the poll here, 33% of respondents believe climate change is the #1 challenge for the European Union. Number 2, security and peace, that's 28%, human rights and democracy, 23%, migration, 9%. Security and peace, that's 28%, human rights and democracy, 23%, migration, 9%, and last but not least, disinformation, 7%. Please continue to vote. Results are being adjusted as we speak. Let me turn to my second phone for the questions, and I'll probably start with two questions. Hopefully you can get back to me for more. The first question from Carlos via Slido, who's asking about, the difficulty of reaching consensus and unanimity. He is asking, should unanimity-based decision-making rules and procedures within the EU foreign policy change in order to make it more efficient? Second question from Dusan Gajic, he's the EU correspondent for RTS. That's about Kosovo and Serbia. Dusan wants to know, says that the Kosovo-Serbia dispute is still on the table. Of all HRs have had to deal with this. Why is it that 20 years after the war in the Balkans, it's still a failure of EU diplomacy? If we can get some reaction from your guest, maybe, and then don't hesitate to return to the newsroom.
Mr. Borrell, let me ask you maybe the first of the two questions, not to escape the second one, of course, but the issue of unanimity. You have said many times that, of course, it means that you always have to reach a consensus that tends to be the lowest common denominator. So, of course, nobody wants to change the treaties, God knows. But what could be managed so that indeed there's a European voice that can be expressed, again, a European narrative, even if it's not an unanimous one?
Well, for sure, to get unanimity among 27 member states, Ms. Mogherini knows very well how difficult it is. My life would be much easier if I could go through qualified majority. And it would be, I think, more constructive, because unanimity is not a big incentive for people to participate in a discussion. Everybody knows that they have their own veto right. They can sit in the corner saying, without me you will not do anything, so you will come. If you were aware that others could agree and you can get out of this agreement, then you will participate in the discussion. You will participate in order to be part of the majority and not to be put in the corner. Not sitting comfortably in the corner, but being pushed to the corner. So we need an incentive to create consensus, and qualified majority is much better for that. But we have unanimity On fiscal issues, fiscal harmonization requires unanimity. We have unanimity on the approval of the budget. Financial perspective requires unanimity. So it's not only in foreign policy where we have this deadlock.
Of course.
I think the European integration needs to have procedures to take decisions which are more flexible, because it's not affordable to spend 3 months to launch Irini operation, because one member state, because one member state who has no navy, so in any case who could not participate in the operation, was blocking.
But that country has an admiral. No navy,
I don't know, but at the end we overcome these difficulties, but we spent 3 months. The world turns around very quickly, too quickly with respect to our decision-making process. But I understand that on that there are big differences. I would be happy just if the member states were ready to use the constructive abstention, which is foreseen in the treaties. You don't agree, but you don't obstruct. You don't want to participate, but you let the others do. This would be the first step in order to advance quicker.
And not only in foreign policy, of course. Mr. Solana, the Serbia-Kosovo issue, a very touchy and difficult one, and especially with the former Kosovo president in The Hague now. What could be done?
Well, I think the way is to continue trying to negotiate between the two sides. It is true that Kosovo today has a added problem, and Serbia, we have to really get Serbia rapidly, because I mean, the Russia would like very much to have Serbia their orbit. And so to play rapidly with Serbia and to offer them the possibility of getting part of the European Union is fundamental. And dedicate with a special envoy or whatever you want to do it, but 24 hours over 24. So this has to be one issue that has to be resolved by putting many hours into it. Now, let me, if you allow me, Christine, say something to the comments of Borrell on unanimity and qualified majorities. I think, and I completely agree with him, that the time which it takes for the agreement among the 27 countries for something that has to be done rapidly, operations of peace, operations of that nature, they have to find a moment of resolve them. If you don't resolve it at that time, you will never resolve it. So rapidity, intelligence in the handling, etc., is fundamental. I mean, I think that coalitions of the willing is something that has to be put into the treaty. I mean, the coalition of the willing should be able to act. If they are ready to act, nobody should prevent that from happening. So the coalition of the willing principle, which at the end is some other way of looking at qualified majority, but is softer for others to accept, the coalition of the willing. And that, for me, is a fundamental. We did it, and we use it at a given moment in my times. And it worked. It worked. When we went to some parts of Africa, there are countries that didn't want to go, but at the end of the day, they accepted others to go. And that is a fundamental change that for Borrell will be very, very happy if he can use the time that he needs better than the wasted time that he has to use today with the paralyzation because of a vote is not doesn't arrive to a final solution among the 27.
Mrs. Mogherini, I believe you're a former Erasmus student, and I think that our friend Christophe has certainly a question about that from current Erasmus students.
Absolutely. We received the question from the Erasmus Student Network, which represents the Erasmus generation. It's I'd like to ask specifically High Representative Borrell if he has any plans throughout his mandate to engage with the Erasmus generation. And last but not least, maybe a nice question to wrap up our discussions today, sent via Slido. Someone is asking Mr. Solana and Mrs. Mogherini, looking back from outside, what would you say you would like to have changed in the way you played your role as HR? And maybe do you have any advice for current HR VP, Mr. Borrell? Back to you.
Mrs. Mogherini, ladies first. The Erasmus, I think, is contributing enormously to our external action. Many times I met Erasmus students during my visits abroad, and these are ambassadors of the European Union with another nationality in their own countries. And they keep the networks, well, I see it now in the College of Europe in Bruges, investing in that generation that has now 20, 25, 30 years, is investing in those that will have responsibilities in different fields, from institutions to the private sector, media, all around the world, and letting them live the European experience in those university years is an investment in having friends of Europe around the world. So it's I would say it's the most natural, even the most fun, and the most productive soft power that the European Union can exercise. So I was very proud of participating with the previous Commission in the proposal to increase the investments on Erasmus, and I could only recommend to do it as much as possible, because investment on European identity of young Europeans and of the knowledge of the European Union of young generations outside of Europe is the best investments we can do also on the external action. And on the advice, I always said Josep doesn't need any advice, and for sure not from me, but maybe one, sleep. Get some sleep. Because maybe, yes, the rhythm can be very intense. You need a lot of energy. And sometimes, or at least it was the case for me, yes, maybe this is something I would do probably a little bit differently. Sometimes you don't have the time to stop and reflect on things. The speed is such, the intensity of meetings, decisions, files to follow, informations is so overwhelming that sometimes you don't take the luxury of taking a bubble of your time and say, okay, but where do we really want to go? You know where you need to go, but to take the luxury of some breathe and sleep, it's needed, and yes, some of what you want to do, and not only what you need to do.
I will tell my head of cabinet.
Yes, that was the advice. Javier Solana, and that will be the conclusion to this fascinating discussion.
I think, Christine, for me, I think that an important failure of the European Union has been the Middle East peace process. It's a drama that we ended up with the President Trump doing something with Saudi Arabia and with Bahrain and Emirates, etc., which never should have been done. Because the deal that we had in the table forever was peace for recognition in a way. So the Arab countries were ready to recognize after peace, or along the peace. But this recognizing for nothing is a big, I wouldn't say a failure of the European Union, but it's a failure of the international community in a way.
And your advice to your successor?
An old friend.
An old friend?
Advice for my successor?
Yes.
No simple advice. I know him very well. I know how hard he works, how intelligent he is, how devoted he is. Not very far from what Federica has said. Don't get exhausted. Take a rest every now and then, and talk with your people and try to review how the main topics are going, the main and most important topics are going. But as Federica said, you don't need advice
yes,
from
Javier,
outside.
I need a lot of advice. I got a lot of advice from you. You know, Javier and I, we are too old to have been Erasmus. We have been Fulbright.
That's not bad either.
We have been Fulbright. Both of us, we had the chance of studying in the U.S. thanks to Senator Fulbright and the American bases in Spain. And we haven't been Erasmus. I've been a father of Erasmus, and I know how important it is. And for sure, we have to expand this experience to the rest of the world in order to make the rest of the world get closer to Europe.
And keep building up the narrative, the European
keep building
narrative.
the narrative. You know, at the beginning you asked me the experience that moved me. And I said, well, the morning of the French soldiers. But during our conversation, I remember another moment that has to be with the narrative. It was in Ethiopia. I had a talk with a 12-year-old girl, a migrant, who went from Ethiopia to Saudi Arabia, walking through Yemen. And then she was exposed to Ethiopia again, and she was not knowing where to go. She had the age of my nipotina, my little children. And I think that we Europeans, we have a moral duty with the rest of the world. And our big threat is the inequality which is growing in the world, because it will be backlash against us. Because we are older than the rest of the world, richer than the rest of the world. We cannot afford to be dependent. We have to have our own will in order to contribute to build a better world. And I think this is at the end the deepest meaning of what the External Action Service is doing.
Well, I think this is indeed the perfect conclusion to this discussion. Thank you to the three of you. Sorry again that Lady Ashton couldn't be with us, but thank you to you, Federica Mogherini. Thank you to Javier Solana in Madrid. Et bon courage, Monsieur Borrell.
Merci.
Merci, à bientôt.
Gracias, Javier. Gracias.